Thank you for joining us in this series called The Black Education Experience in the United States, Testaments of Courage, Freedom, Resilience, and Dignity. Today's lesson will look at the issue of outlaw education, Black education as resistance to institutional racism. There may be no better way to appreciate the power inherent in a thing than to understand the effort made to keep others from obtaining that thing, whatever it may be. In the case of education in the United States, the African American experience has much to teach us about the power of education as the great equalizer. The African American community is the only group of people in this nation's history to have their education rendered a crime. For more than 200 years, it was against the law to teach an enslaved African how to read, to write, and enslaved Africans were forbidden from educating themselves. This was the law and order of the 1600s all the way through the 1800s, up to the Civil War. Africans enslaved risked their lives to obtain the most rudimentary learning. That history sets the course for any conversation on education and Black people and any related matter, including employment, housing, and health. The first such laws appear in the colony of South Carolina in 1740. Whereas the having of slaves taught to read or write, or suffering them to be employed in writing, may be attended with great inconveniences, be it enacted, that all and every person and persons whatsoever who shall hereafter teach or cause any slave or slaves to be taught to write, or shall use or employ any slave as a scribe in any manner of writing whatsoever, hereafter taught to write, every such person or persons shall, for every such offense, forfeit the sum of 100 pounds, current money. This law would soon be adopted by other colonies, each with increased levels of punishment. Next slide. In Georgia, this act would be integrated into their body of statutes as late as 1829, where it says that if any slave, Negro, or free person of color, or any white person shall teach any other slave, Negro, or free person of color to read or write either written or printed characters, the said free person of color or slave shall be punished by fine and whipping, or fine or whipping at the discretion of the court. And if a white person so offending, he, she, or they shall be punished with fine, not exceeding $500 and imprisonment in the common jail at the discretion of the court, before whom said offender is tried. What I want you to note here is that even free persons of color were not permitted literacy. Also note that physical punishment was reserved for Africans and free persons of color. The greatest threat was always reserved for Black persons in pursuit of literacy and education. Dr. Carter G. Woodson, in his classic work, The Miseducation of the Negro, published in 1933, best captures the meaning of these laws when he wrote that, quote, when you control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions. You do not have to tell him not to stand here or go yonder. He will find his proper place and will stay in it, end quote. The proper place for Black people as established and affirmed by these laws was slavery. Keeping Africans enslaved away from any learning that would cause them to reflect upon and thus resist their enchained condition, a condition that the system was dependent upon. In very obvious ways, those laws were established to serve as a safeguard against an enslaved person acquiring the means to navigate their way out of the ignorance that slavery necessitated and find their footing on the pathway to freedom. In this respect, no other person better embodies this duality of oppression and liberation and the critical role of education than the one Frederick Douglass, arguably the greatest orator in the history of the United States. Douglass was born into slavery. A little bit of alphabet learning he received was like gasoline to the flame of liberty that burned within him since he was a child. Some men know the value of education by having it, said Douglass. I know its value by not having it. In an address entitled Lecture on Slavery, delivered in Rochester, New York on December 1, 1850, Douglass said the following about education as the enemy of slavery. The first work of slavery is to mar and deface those characteristics of its victims which distinguish people from things and persons from property. It reduces man to a mere machine as the serpent charmer of India is compelled to extract the deadly teeth of his venomous prey before he is able to handle him with impunity. So the slaveholder must strike down the conscience of the slave before he can obtain the mastery over his victim. Nor is slavery more adverse to the conscience than it is to the mind. This is shown by the fact that in every state of the American Union where slavery exists, there are laws absolutely prohibitory of education among the slaves. The great mass of slaveholders look upon education among the slaves as utterly subversive of the slave system. Douglass would go on to say, it is perfectly well understood at the South that to educate a slave is to make him discontented with slavery and to invest him with a power which shall open to him the treasures of freedom. And since the object of the slaveholder is to maintain complete authority over his slave, his constant vigilance is exercised to prevent everything which militates against or endangers the stability of his authority. Education being among the menacing influences and perhaps the most dangerous is, therefore, the most cautiously guarded against. Given this history, African Americans have long understood the value of education. It has been the treasured achievement of knowledge and learning, the means to claim ownership of oneself, and the capacity to chart one's journey to self-actualization, otherwise known as freedom, and community development. Whether in the effort to escape the physical chains of slavery or to achieve a measure of freedom by ways of unlocking the enforced chains of sanctioned illiteracy, Black people carried a thirst for learning that no whip or threat thereof could take from them. As recorded in just about every slave narrative written, African Americans risked their lives to steal an education and shared forward whatever learning they acquired with their fellow bondsmen and bondswomen. In a world yet stricken by oppression marked by race, the pursuit of a quality education as a pathway to a better life remains the preferred means for a community for whom education has never been a guarantee. In recent years, some have risked their very freedom to see that their children are able to receive the best education possible, whether using the address of relatives in districts with better schools or using a fake address due to homelessness. We have seen cases of African American parents convicted of larceny, stealing an education for their children. The chains of slavery have been replaced with the structural confines of generational poverty. The laws that today link quality education to property ownership are the living legacy of this history of anti-Black codes and restrictions. This dynamic of oppression is further heightened in light of 2019 bribery and cheating scandal that exposed a generations-long practice of wealthy white families bribing their way into the best colleges in the country. Daniel Golden, senior editor at ProPublica and the author of the book, The Price of Admission, How America's Ruling Class Buys Its Way into Elite Colleges and Who Gets Left Outside the Gates, captured this duality of Black oppression and white privilege these cases brought forth, when he stated in a PBS interview, quote, "There is a racial component. The legacy preference for alumni children disproportionately benefits whites. And the proportion of legacy students at elite universities can be anywhere from 10% to 20% of the student body or even higher. And people tend to criticize traditional affirmative action in a vacuum, as if the rest of the system were merit-based, and affirmative action was the only preference that interferes with that. But actually, it's dwarfed by the combined prevalence of these other preferences that favor the rich and the white. The inherent contradictions of this society are evident in its educational system that proclaims itself a meritocracy, yet is erected on the edifice of property value and ownership. We cannot engage in honest conversation of education in the US without first acknowledging the depraved foundation such inequality was founded upon, that legally bound those it deemed 3/5 of a person into 2 centuries of tortured ignorance as safeguard for the material prosperity of those deemed as citizens. A citizenry whose status continues to be maintained by this history. When we talk about legacy students, it is this legacy that should come first to mind. In such a society, any act meant to secure a modicum of education as a means toward a better life must be viewed through the lens of this history to be properly understood and appreciated. Otherwise, you risk reinforcing the very structures of oppression such persons taking such actions are seeking to overcome. Frederick Douglass once said that to deny education to any people is one of the greatest crimes against human nature. It is to deny them the means of freedom and the rightful pursuit of happiness, and to defeat the very end of their being. African Americans, in their generation's effort to chart a path to freedom by the compass marked in their pursuit of education, has become a road paved by their labors that is now walked by many other communities regardless of the size of their bank accounts or their national origins. It is the testament of the fearlessness of a community whose perseverance in the face of institutional immorality is a light on the path for education as a human right for all people. For those interested, we certainly hope that those of you watching are interested in continuing your education on these topics. Here are a great set of books that I invite you to consider. Self-Taught, African American Education, Slavery and Freedom by Heather Andrea Williams. Of course, as I mentioned often in my presentation, Frederick Douglass himself, the writer and author of his book, My Bondage and My Freedom. When Affirmative Action Was White, An Untold History of Racial Inequality in 20th Century America by Ira Katznelson, and The Price of Admission, as mentioned earlier, How America's Ruling Class Buys Its Way into Elite Colleges by Daniel Goldin. And for those who are ready to take the learning on to a whole nother level completely, I invite you to contact racial-justice.org and learn more about the work of Origin. Again, thank you so much for this time.